But what about reality itself? Could reality also be a subjective matter, just as morality is? Billions of years ago, the universe was made and the earth was formed, or so the narrative of the prevalent scientific community goes. Then, simple cells were formed out of chemical reactions inside a random chemical soup. Millions of years later, complex cells were formed, from which more complex organisms had evolved. Little fish teemed the oceans, then big fish. Then legs grew out of one of them as it began to crawl on dry land. Here's the question. Is there any evidence to support anything I've just told you? Now, I know the scientific community says there's plenty of evidence, but is there really any evidence for the Big Bang, other than the theory, based on observations of current movements of galaxies billions of light years after the supposed event? Is there an actual, tangible evidence for the existence of any primordial soup having spontaneously generated a simple cell? Every cell we have observed in nature proves that there is nothing simple about a cell. It is incredibly complex, where the least of which has at least 300 proteins, each of which requiring an incredibly complicated and precise molecular structure, whereby if only one part of a protein molecule is wrongly made, the whole thing would not even work. But today, we will grant them their evidences, lacking as they may be, because this is not an evidence debunking video against the theory of evolution. We will not argue nor challenge their presented evidences. What we will do instead is challenge their presuppositions. People who believe in evolution claim that they follow science. But what is science? As defined, science is the intellectual and practical activity encompassing the systematic study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observation and experiment. This means that for science to work, it will need to acquire information from the mind's analytical power as well as sense data. Acquiring knowledge from the human senses is what is known as empiricism, which is a philosophical discipline developed by renowned intellectuals such as John Locke, George Berkeley, and David Hume. Evolutionists require empirical data to corroborate their narratives. They study bones in the dirt and make forensic tests to determine their age and what species they belong to. They examine the rocks and minerals surrounding them and in which layers the bones have been found in. They look through microscopes to study molecular DNA of various species to determine a correlation between them. They look from telescopes at the stars and galaxies, trying to determine the origin of the universe. But if we are to solely rely on our own senses, as well as on our own analytical capabilities, we must at least understand what kind of limitations we have in this type of knowledge acquiring. Could our senses detect reality as reality is? Or are we merely experiencing phenomena? Are our reasoning capabilities impaired by the data we are receiving? Although rationalistic and empirical processes seem self-evident, they are far from it, for they depend on many factors in order to make them possible. One of the most important concepts which challenge empiricism is our limited ability to acquire knowledge from the external world. Empirical data relies essentially on the human perception through physical senses, what we see, what we feel, what we hear, touch, and taste. In the early modern age, Descartes was the first to argue that sensory appearances actually provided no reliable knowledge of the external world. He first invoked the errors of the senses during meditation. He suggested that because the senses sometimes deceive, there was no reason why he could reliably trust them. Later philosophers like David Hume, Immanuel Kant, and George Hegel arrived at the same conclusions, for the senses might be merely yielding perceptions that misrepresent their objects and hence lead to erroneous beliefs about the real properties of the material world. This is why they were all clear about separating what they receive as sensory data from what is externally out there. This is what is known as phenomenalism. The ramifications of this skepticism would not go away, not even today. We know that sensory data is transferred by electrical signals through our synapses to our brain. This is similar in a way to the signals through transistors inside a computer processor. This computer, like us, also has an input interface, such as the keyboard and the mouse. If I were to jumble up the keys on that keyboard and then try to write a story by pressing on the wrongly placed letters, all that would come out on the screen is gibberish. By altering the state of the computer's interface, I have altered its perception of what the reality of its input truly is. Similarly, when we look into the telescope at the stars and the constellations, our perception is limited to the photons traveling through our eyes and hitting our retinas, where photon-sensitive nerve cells pick up the light and color, then send signals to our brain for visual recognition. So what if these photons we are receiving are indicative of a partial reality, or perhaps no reality at all? What if Plato was right, that we live in a world of mere shadows, while the actual reality was in another realm of existence? The problem of the perception of reality dates back for thousands of years. But seeing that empiricism is a well-established discipline, how is it that they could not foresee this problem, knowing that the early empiricists like John Locke and Berkeley were also well-established philosophers? Being a deist, John Locke had conceded to the fact that God, being a first cause, was necessary. He needed the appeal to God if he were to trust his own senses. George Berkeley also made the argument that the cause of sensation is external and objective, thereby making God as the constant cause. Descartes, as a rationalist, had also made an appeal to a good God, so that he would be able to trust the a priori ideas in his own mind. It seemed for the empiricists, as well as the rationalists of the early modern age, that an appeal to God was an imperative factor for our ability to gain knowledge of the external world. This was made flagrantly apparent with the advent of a Scotsman by the name of David Hume. For Hume was a skeptic, even when it came to God, which is why he did not rely on God as a first cause. This is what caused the entire metaphysical realm of Western philosophy to crack. This crack kept on expanding until postmodernism, where the entire metaphysical realm is now completely shattered. Hume reasserted the ancient problem of the external world with force. He believed that all that we can know is our own experiences, not reality in its own self. This reduced our perception of the external world to nothing more than appearances, or phenomena, for Hume was not sure whether his own senses were conveying the accurate properties of reality. This meant that reality to Hume became unknown, for if his own senses were unreliable in conveying accurate properties, how could reality be gauged? As reality was unknowable, the possibility of knowledge also became unknowable. Subsequently, values such as ethics also became unknowable, for the ethical values came from our knowledge of humanity. This is commonly known as the Hume's is-ought problem. In every system of morality which I have hitherto met with, I have always remarked that the author proceeds for some time in the ordinary way of reasoning, when of a sudden I am surprised to find that instead of the usual copulations of propositions, is and is not, I meet with no proposition that is not connected with an ought or an ought not. Even today, people struggle with Hume's is-ought problem, where they will unknowingly take the leap between what they perceive and what they propose as a valued judgment. Hume was truly ingenious in catching on to this seemingly natural slip we all tend to make and hardly recognize. This is one of the pitfalls many of the atheists I have discussed with fall into. Number one, God is not part of reality. That's an is statement. Number two, those who believe in God reject reality. That is also an is statement. Number three, rejection of reality is a moral ought statement. As you can see, we have jumped from an is statement to an ought statement here. I'll give you another example. This time it's about evolution. Man came from the apes. Is statement. Apes are animals. Another is statement. We must care for animals. Ought statement. Why can't we do that? Why can't we make this jump from an is to an ought? Some people believe that if we launch our worldviews from what we perceive, then what we will receive as fact statements or is statements become value-free. Objects perceived in the material world do not give us enough information about what they ought to be, because what we perceive as an is a particular, not an absolute. If I tell you, this mouse is red, that's an is statement. Then I say, it ought not to be this way, because it clashes with the carpet. That's an ought statement, of course. However, you could tell me, this is your opinion. I think this mouse ought to be red, because it looks pretty on your desk. But what does that mean really? Does the ought of reality differ by individual? Are the oughts mere opinions and therefore subjective, while reality or the is objective? This Humean is-ought problem is the reason why so many people today think morality is subjective. The evolutionists are necessarily among those people because they have eliminated from their worldview all metaphysical causes outside the material world. By doing that, their first cause to their being had to be a material one. But if morality is subjective, does that imply that there is no morality at all? I have always asserted to many of the atheists I have debated that if we are to become the final arbiters of morality as human beings, then we cannot have any morality at all. Atheists would argue back, like this gentleman here, that we do this all the time in legal courts of law, so we do have the authority to determine our oughts and ought nots. This here is a common error, usually made by the best of atheists and evolutionists in general. This is a person I debated on Twitter. He is the director of philosophy of one of the biggest universities in the world, but I will not share his name here. So, here is the response I gave him, which is a well-known challenge by Christians on the matter of morality by majority or consensus. Had Hitler won World War II, would us making judgments against minorities become meaningful and just? In other words, could Hitler's massacres become just and meaningful? The guy answered with a dry no, knowing that this was a question with terrible ramifications had he answered either way. So he wisely chose to cut it dry. A wise decision. So, in order not to engage in matters that would divert from our objective, I repackaged my question. But it's possible that in the future, the majority of people will call us evil for legalizing abortion. Do you deny that possibility? The point of this argument was to show the professor that he could not rely on the fickle nature of humanity to determine a reliable moral code. As he told me before, that the us are the ones who can determine moral values, I showed him here that there might be a possibility that this us could be evil. If the us is evil, then how can the judgment of us be any good? His entire premise would then fall apart. I think the professor here was rash in sending his next tweet because he inadvertently put himself right where I wanted him. What he answered was, yes, it is possible. The man was hooked. My final answer to him was, if you cannot verify that you are good or evil, how can you verify that your judgment is just? You have lost all your value structure. Conclusion: subjective morality is no morality. There is absolutely no moral structure for atheists because they rely on the fickle nature of man. This leads us to the conclusion that humanity can never realize an objective moral standard. Without a moral ballast outside of humanity, each group of people will set out on its own way to determine its values, its rights and wrongs, its do's and don'ts. Is abortion moral? Is euthanasia? What about changing the sexes of little children without parental consent? Men going into the little girl's room just because they identify as little girls? What used to be considered inconceivable merely 10 years ago is now becoming an imposed norm. Progressivists will keep pushing their agendas for change after change. Is all this change good? There is no way for us to find out if it's good or not, because we cannot even prove to ourselves if we are good or evil, let alone our moral judgments. But what about reality itself? Could reality also be a subjective matter, just as morality is? Keeping in mind that morality is a value, and we already know that some values come directly from knowledge, while knowledge itself is an interpretation or an image of reality. I'll give you an example. Number one, a reality. Sheep's wool. That's a hard reality, which on its own is value-free. I mean, we're talking basically about sheep's body hair, essentially. Number two, truth. We gain knowledge from the reality of wool by learning the wool's characteristics. Part of that knowledge we gain is that wool gives us warmth in the winter. Number three, value. Now that we have gained the knowledge that wool is associated with warmth, we have immediately set a value over wool because warmth in the winter is good for us. Based on this value we have learned, what ought should we assign to wool? Do we assign the value wool ought to be used for kindling? We would say no, because that would be wasting the valuable wool. Instead, we assign an ought that is more relatable to the reality of wool, like wool ought to be woven into coats. Understanding ourselves and the world around us starts by identifying reality. You cannot have truth without reality, because truth defines what is real, and by contrast, what is not real. If you do not know what the real is, you cannot determine what the truth is. Also, you cannot know what the value of an object is without learning about its truth. The value we place over wool is a measurable one. We put wool on us and then we become warm. With moral values, it gets a little bit trickier. Because if we say, for example, women should work the same jobs as men, we will not gauge the repercussions of this value until we send a woman off to work in an oil rig, for example, or perhaps a porter at the airport, where heavy lifting is a necessary part of the job. So then we realize that we need to go back to our moral value and tweak it a little bit to fit with the reality that a woman's muscle mass is on average 15% less than a man's. This is actually a challenging remark to Hume's rule of not deriving an ought from an is. If we are deriving values from reality, such as the warmth of wool and the physique of a woman, then values are necessarily linked to reality. But giving Hume his due right, there is a serious problem in the fact that many of us extrapolate values that are not entirely established in reality, such as the value statement that women should work the same jobs as men, with the reality of a woman's muscle density. Given that the woman is very capable of functioning well, same as a man, in many job fields, is a proof that this value carries a lot of merit to it. It is in fact a testament that setting an equal field for women and men in the job market reflects the reality of a woman's ability to function just as well as a man does. This is where this value intersects with reality. However, this value does not intersect with reality everywhere, such as the jobs with high physical demands. And so we would have to go back to revise the value in order to make it fit better with reality. We started with the value statement. Women should work the same jobs as men. So now we modify it by adding, with the possible exception of some jobs that require high physical demands. So as you can see, values, even moral values, need to be validated by reality in order to apply. Otherwise, the value itself would have to be revised or sometimes removed entirely. So essentially, we need to keep in mind this one fundamental axiom. Values evaluate what is real. They do not evaluate what is not real. But wouldn't Hume's principle in this case be fundamentally wrong? If values are being derived from reality, then wouldn't this refute Hume by establishing that you can derive an ought from an is? However, if we go back to David Hume, we would note that his problem was in fact more fundamental than the values which are derived from reality. Hume had a problem with reality itself. David Hume was a skeptic when it came to reality. Like I have said before, Hume was not sure whether his own senses were conveying the accurate properties of reality. This is why he denied the human possibility of gaining any knowledge. Because if you cannot perceive reality, how can you have knowledge of reality? From that point, Hume went on to deny the possibility of value generation from reality, which was obvious, seeing that we cannot know what reality is. The Humean problem lies essentially in our perception of reality, not in the values derived from reality. Had we known reality for what it actually was, the knowledge derived from reality would have been possible, and our values would have been congruent. Not knowing what reality truly is in all its aspects will always cause us to extrapolate faulty values, which will only serve to reflect our poor ability to gauge the real nature of reality. Now here comes the real problem. We have already determined that materialists are incapable of deriving any moral values because they are dependent on the fickle nature of man. But if moral values are derived from reality and materialists are incapable of having any moral values, what would that say about their reality? Do they even have a reality, or is it all mere subjective perception of phenomena? What does that say about science itself? The empirical process, our studies of nature and man. Does an external world even exist? It seems that skepticism over reality remains persistent and would not be shaken, especially that now we have re-established the link between values and reality. This is why it is no longer possible for materialists to claim an objective reality in which they could do their science experiments and come up with scientifically based claims about evolution and the origins of the universe. But then they turn around and declare that their moral values are subjective. Because they conceded to the notion that objective morality was impossible, they have also thrown the towel on the possibility of having an objective reality. And here lies the evolutionist dilemma. No longer can materialists declare the scientific veracity of the theory of evolution based on science alone without first conceding that moral values are no longer subjective but objective. For subjective values cannot reflect an objective reality. But what is the truth of the matter? Are both reality and morality subjective? Or are they both objective? Subjective morality is basically every person with his own morals, meaning that there are no guidelines for society or rules or anything. It is absolute anarchy. Subjective reality, however, is much worse. If every person has his own reality, then there is no external world. There is only you. Everything your senses are bombarding your brain is no more than a fantasy, a projection, a hallucination. Even your own brain is doubtful to exist. Your own body and your own soul. Is the Matrix movie actually real? Are we all hooked up to a grid, being fed information so we could remain docile? Or perhaps reality is even more sinister. Are you now trapped inside the belly of a cosmic beast who is holding your senses captive so you would not resist it as it digests you to oblivion? The world as we know it is now in question. The more we disengage from objective morality, the more reality itself slips away. Our times today are witnessing the great beginnings of material nihilism. But hold on a second. This picture is actually not that grim. I have actually built up to this point by philosophical analysis alone, which is not wrong, but it does not fully reveal what is truly going on in the world. The reality is that materialists might accept the eventuality that their morality is subjective, seeing that it is people dependent. However, the reality of the matter is that no matter what they do, and no matter how far they bend their moral backbone, they cannot escape the fact that morality is objective. To prove this, I'm going to read a short paragraph from my book, The Liberal Geowave, beginning of chapter 27. Building an entire worldview strictly on relative values is impossible. Either you have to make some sort of assertions to tether your relative values on them, or you have to make the general assertion that there is nothing but relative values. In both cases, you are forced to make at least one objective assertion of a value. It is because making an objective assertion is the one thing that is going to give your worldview the value that you need to stand upon. Otherwise, it will drag you into the abyss. A world where only relative notions exist is logically, emotionally, and spiritually impossible. For if you lose value, you lose reality. In a nutshell, if you make this value statement that all values are subjective, then the value of this very statement is also a subjective one. Because if all values are subjective, then this value in itself is also a subjective value, and that would render it worthless. You would have to concede at least this one value as an objective value for the system to work. But then you would have lost the battle, because that would falsify the statement, all values are subjective. This can only mean one thing. The subjectivity of values is logically impossible to exist without objective values. And if objective values exist, then objective reality must also exist. But what is objective reality? Obviously, we cannot rely on our own senses to find it out. Otherwise, we would have been able to derive objective morality from it. Seeing that we are unable to discover objective morality from objective reality is a sign that we do not know objective reality. Like I said before, the problem of Hume begins with his skepticism about reality before his skepticism about morality. The problem of the external world seems to be persistent and would not go away. Ever since the dawn of logical reasoning has this problem existed, and it seems for the material evolutionists the problem is here to stay. But now the problem is more serious, because we now know without a doubt that objective reality exists. But we also know that we do not know what it is. This compromises all our empirical studies, for empiricism itself is compromised. So what we granted of the supposed evidences presented by the evolutionists in the beginning of this video is now invalidated, because there is no means for us to trust empirical evidence for certain, or even probable knowledge, in a materialistic worldview. We seem to be stuck. Objective morality exists, and it points to the existence of an objective reality. Yet we are unable to identify either one of them. Are we doomed to spend our pathetic lives probing in the dark in search for them? This is a problem without a solution. Our universe has given us poor means to detect objective reality, and by that we have lost the means to gain actual knowledge, which present to us actual objective values that will give meaning to our lives. There is no way out of this unless